Here's Alex O'Connor to debate a bunch of Christians.
My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
If God is, by definition, all-powerful and all-loving, then the existence of suffering would make his existence not just unlikely, but altogether nonsensical.
On theism, if you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
What is your, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that, an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course, we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some, Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth.
I like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity,
Okay.
because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
I think Alex meant Rawlsian veil of ignorance rather than state of nature. Alex is asking whether, if you didn't know anything about the world except for the fact that a loving, all-powerful God made it, would you expect it to have as much suffering as it does? I sure wouldn't.
I guess I just don't really see how you can justify that claim per se. What I would say is that if we actually take into account the holistic view of the scriptures, which I do think that you have to do, we see that it's actually much more coherent once you acknowledge that evil itself doesn't have ontology. Evil's not a thing. You don't look under a rock and say, there's the evil, right?
Fine by me.
So
I'm not really talking about evil here, because that's, of course, a moral term. I'm talking about suffering.
can you distinctualize suffering and evil?
So evil is a moral term. Evil means that something is bad, it's immoral. You need to have a moral ontology for that. Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced.
A common rebuttal that apologists make when you bring up suffering is to conflate it with the problem of evil. They love to say that if you don't believe in any objective good or bad, which they believe requires a God, then you can't say that what God does is bad. Alex is not saying that suffering is bad, only that it's not at all clear why a loving God would allow so much of it.
Good work.
Alex and Matt, good to
How's it
meet you.
going?
My
Nice to
name's
meet you
Tim.
too.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is, what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
It is more specifically a problem with the idea that any God which may exist is both all-powerful and all-loving.
I think that if God is all-loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on,
Yeah.
horrendous or whatever
In
that is?
particular, non-human animal suffering. Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists.
Yeah.
Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff. None of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
How exactly would human free will explain the suffering of animals who suffered and died long before humans ever existed? How could eating from the tree of knowledge have caused that?
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness.
No, it's not the value system I attach to it, it's the definition I attach to it. I don't understand what love means if someone can love you and also allow you to experience preventable, pointless suffering. If there is an all-powerful God, then all suffering is preventable and pointless. God would have the power to prevent any suffering and the power to achieve any purpose without using suffering.
Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals,
Great.
and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection such that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything.
Why would a loving God allow suffering and redeem it later rather than prevent it in the first place?
The first time, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and where their life permanently ends.
Why would you not care about both? Why would a loving God not make a pleasant life with a pleasant ending instead of a life of suffering with a pleasant ending?
Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative, and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they lived. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now.
Why can't we judge both? If God is all-powerful, then he can write the story to be happy all the way through. And if he's loving, why wouldn't he do that?
For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table, but sure, go ahead.
I guess this guy thinks that a marmot will go to heaven when it dies and say, I'm glad I was eaten by that crocodile because of how it served God's overall plan. That they will have the ability to appreciate God's plan when they get there, and that God could not have accomplished this plan without that marmot being eaten by a crocodile.
That I'm not laying
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
I don't understand why a loving God would put any creature through suffering that it didn't have to go through. That's sadism, not love.
Okay, gotcha. So we can
Do you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil, correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that suffering.
Yeah, but you're saying it's a necessary connection. What's the term necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, redeemability, or we call it defeasibility.
I don't see how suffering is justified just because it is redeemable. Why would a loving God allow someone to suffer and then redeem that suffering instead of preventing the suffering altogether? Why would he prefer the former over the latter?
If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history where they look at their life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. You're probably talking about this post-mortem example. Sure. I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually see that.
Can we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer.
It's not means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might.
If it's not means to ends, why did you bring up the ends?
Cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000, but why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming, so I saw your debate with Trent.
You've been voted out by the majority.
Awesome,
Please
man.
return to your seat.
I wish I could have heard his response to that, because it seems to me Alex showed that this guy's conception of God is that he is not all-powerful. God apparently doesn't have the power to achieve his ends without allowing suffering. Maybe this guy thinks that getting punched in the face for $20,000 is somehow preferable to just getting $20,000 for free.
Good stuff.
Ooh.
So close. Hey.
Nice to meet you. My
How's
name's
it going?
Hayden. How are you?
Hayden. Nice to meet me.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Well, you could say that one of the reasons why suffering exists is because nobody has both the power and inclination to abolish it. If there is someone with the power to abolish it, and that someone is all-loving, it's much harder to explain why such a person would not be inclined to abolish it.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism
Okay.
does.
I disagree. I don't see how theism accounts for consciousness at all. God is allegedly a consciousness that exists for no reason. I've heard arguments that aim to show that he is conscious. For example, the argument that a causeless first cause has to be a free choice made by a conscious mind. But that argument doesn't explain why God is conscious in the first place. I've also heard the argument that consciousness is fundamental to reality, but that also doesn't explain why it exists. It simply denies that it needs an explanation.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true, yeah.
So if atheism cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you agree
so
with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalposts. If you don't want to grant the existence of the material world before we start talking about this, we can do an argument from consciousness. But then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism. What I'm going to say is this.
Sure.
What I'm going to say is this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe.
That wouldn't explain consciousness per se, though, because it wouldn't explain why God's consciousness exists. It's also not clear how a God could be conscious. Consciousness seems to be comprised of actions like thinking, feeling, perceiving, etc. Something has to be carrying out those actions, and it looks most likely that the brain does. God doesn't have a brain, so what carries out his conscious actions? God is also supposedly timeless, so how can any actions or consciousness itself be carried out without time?
We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God. But the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came up with?
Tell me it.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here.
The idea of God would be somewhat less nonsensical if God were not all-loving and/or not all-powerful. The question of why suffering exists, if there is a God, would be much more satisfyingly answered if you could just say, God has limited resources and this is just the best he can do. And/or this is the best God cares to do. Instead, apologists say, the cosmos is awesome enough as it is, which isn't very convincing.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose?
If God is all-powerful, then it's a contradiction to say that anything is necessary for him to achieve his ends. To say that suffering is necessary for God to achieve his ends is to say that this supposedly all-powerful God does not have the power to achieve his ends without suffering.
If Christianity is true, then I think it must be necessary because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're not talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not. Because I don't think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all.
The idea that suffering evolved because it disincentivizes us from doing things that reduce our chances of surviving and reproducing makes perfect sense to me. That, of course, requires consciousness, so maybe this guy means that consciousness makes no sense without God. But as I already explained, consciousness makes even less sense with God, because it denotes the existence of an ultimate consciousness that can exist independent of its essential prerequisites of time and space. That's a contradiction.
But, okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody, and wants to love everybody, and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
If there is a God who is all-powerful, then yes, that God has the power to make that happen. And it is, therefore, possible. It is only impossible if no such entity exists.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.